functional neuroscience, and also exercise rehabilitation definitively in that area as well, and in the theory and practicum of success psychology, let us say, but integrated with everything else. Today's topic, oh, by the way, in functional, with the functional life form, what we're looking to do is to bring up topics that reflect the functionality of life in the areas and arenas of functional medicine, functional neurology, but also in the function of life, the function of the brain and the mind, the function of communication and languaging, even going all the way into the levels, of course, the function of movement and its integration. All the way going to, which I would love to open up and explore at one point, the aspect of the metamechanics of metaphysics as what I would say is the third column in a healing approach. The first two columns being the molecular, whether that is food, nutrition, even pharmacokinetics as far as drugs, the molecular aspect of the human, the brain and the neuronal aspect of the human, and then I consider the third column the metaphysical aspect of the human. And of course, there are the other components on a holistic aspect, socioeconomic, and all the rest that comprise the world upon which we function or dysfunction. So, autonomic nervous system is our topic, and I'm not going to bore you with a lecture on the autonomic nervous system. What the functional life form is to bring perspectives, bring concepts and new ways of thinking about old subjects, even new ways of thinking of cutting edge subjects that we can put up to the forum, put up to the population of those who are in the natural life business forum, naturalized business partnership, as well as this is open to the general public, anyone who wishes to integrate with us, and then get feedback and become more. So to start, it's interesting, the autonomic nervous system. I'm not going to ask the question. Everyone has an idea of the autonomic or the automatic nervous system. It's the unconscious part of the brain that gets into regulation from everything from heart rate, contraction to of course, gut signaling, gut motility, to aspects of urinary, general urinary function, fertility, right down the line. And of course, the two big things of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which everyone really knows to a great extent. The sympathetic being the fight, flight, fear response, the parasympathetic being rest, digest, rest, restore, feed and breed, however we like to look at. But I'd like to just start with that these are the extremes, that these are the extremes of this system, which is always playing, which is always in a dynamic balance. And I'd like to, I'm going to start there and give a backdrop of what I want us to think about. But again, in preparing for this talk, there's so many things to talk about, right? On the autonomic nervous system. However, I tended to start to move towards stress response, which I really do believe should be a topic down the road. Stress in general, which is truly misunderstood by conventional medicine at any level. And I'd love to talk about that someday. But I started to move in that direction, and I said, okay, I'm just going to go with it. However, what I'd like to put forward at the end of this is for us to have a different look at the power of the autonomic nervous system in our lives, and particularly how we can look at this very powerful platform, a platform that's much more powerful, that is a life platform. I call it a life platform, upon which our life is constructed and occurs, and utilize that in a much more potent way to affect and change the system. And it's being done currently now, but we can do it far greater and far better. So at the end of this, that's what I'm looking for us to inoculate our minds with, to stimulate the thinking, and then I'll offer. We'll definitely get more into it, and I'm always available to talk. Okay, I just have some notes. So one of the things I'd like everyone to think about is the sympathetic and parasympathetic portions. The two, they're not antagonists, they're actually complementary portions of this automatic nervous system we have. I want to think about a seesaw, that, you know, on one side we have the sympathetic and the other side we have the parasympathetic, and they do exist in a kind of balance. It's not an exact analogy, because in essence it could go like this as well, but let's think about it like this. In a fight or flight response, sympathetic goes up, parasympathetic has to go down. It occurs like that. Now that a lot of people understand, but it's that imbalance. Well, here's what, it's a plastic system. What I mean by that is, like, if you push on one side, it'll come back. Push on the other side, it'll come back. That's a strongly functional autonomic nervous system. What happens a lot of times is that this is the normal. It's already offset when it gets perturbated, or it's easier to influence. In the example of a high sympathetic, that's easily threshold by the minor stress response, and it doesn't come back to a base dynamic equilibrium, which is where we need to be in every function. But that's one aspect. But I want you guys to think about a y-axis, a pole, that this system can be highly empowered. Both sides are up high on the y-axis, high up here, very balanced in their performance, which is critically important, but powerful. They're both powerful. Now, what we can have is a balanced system that is low. So both are very low, and we get responses there, and it can be low and off balance. So we have two things we want to consider, and this is just for those practitioners that are out there seeing people. When they see a human and they start to consider one aspect of their paradigm in the autonomic nervous system, that they know and think in these terms. It helps tremendously. We're not getting into that today. I just want to put it forward as a thought form for you guys. So let's see. By the way, I had a stress event before getting on. My new personal computer crashed. The screen is half fuzzy. I'm like, oh my God, I'm having a stress response. So I was looking to have my notes on something else. Okay. So let's look at the aspect of a stress response. Let's look at this from the aspect of the sympathetics. So with the autonomic nervous system, we have, when someone goes under stress, and this is, I'm going to look at it from this perspective. Let me just back up one more second. Sympathetics and parasympathetics, some basic aspects that everyone kind of understands. We'll throw it out there. The sympathetic response is going to be increased heart rate. By the way, glucose, adrenaline, cortisol, we'll get to these terms and words. It is that fear or flight response in the extreme. And we get increased heart rate. We get vasodilation of bronchioles, more air can come in. Vasoconstriction, blood pressure goes up. We get a shutdown of the gut component of motility, shuts down. Blood flow to the organs, the other organ shuts down. Sweating, pupils will dilate, which is a really phenomenal way of checking the system, and other things. The parasympathetic, gut motility, movement of the food bolus through. aspects of sleep and going into a sleep state, vasodilation, gas exchange at the lungs, and on from there, aspects of the urinary bladder, all other things. But let's look at a topic that is huge out there today, the aspect of a stress response and thinking about stress. And I'm not going to go into what stress is, but let's just say that we have a sympathetic response, because I want to move into some thinking about this. Again, everything is about the balance, which I'll talk about as we go through. So in a regular stress response, the sympathetic goes up, and it could be anything. Let's put that there is it could be a fear flight situation. It could be a cognitive event. An on-racing car is coming at you, and you need to move. You need to do something to avoid being killed. So one's a cognitive event. Everything is a cognitive event for the most part. The other thing is, exercise, high intensity exercise, as an example. All right. The sympathetics go on, and a couple of things happen right away. And I'm going to talk from the brain down at some point, but let's just look at the adrenal glands. The adrenals as an extension of the nervous system. They're actually neurotrophic tissue. They're actually an extension of the central nervous system. So you get a blast of epinephrine, adrenaline. It goes and increases the heart rate and increases oxygenation to the lungs, opens up your pupils, brings more light in, does all these things. But it also does a couple other things. It starts an inflammatory reaction, a short-lived inflammatory reaction. Why? One of the reasons, of course, is it excites metabolism. It allows for increased activation at the cellular level. Inflammation, of course, is incredibly important. Without it, we would surely die. It's the chronic inflammation that's an issue, and we'll get into that in a second. So this short-term inflammatory response kicks in, and then what happens in the secondary effect is, any of the practitioners or doctors out there, it starts from the brain, it's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And we got a bunch of things that happen. Molecules get produced, or down to AC, it doesn't matter. Each one drives all the way into the adrenals to make a longer lasting response that actually produces cortisol and looks to decrease the inflammatory response, but it has an effect on insulin and glucose. And this is kind of where I'm going. There's a lot to talk about, but I want to, a lot of people are doing weight loss. A lot of people are, of course, in inflammatory responses. A lot of clients are having inflammation, and there's multiple inflammatory paths as well as neuro-inflammatory paths. But I want to stop here and just check. The aspect is the sympathetics are kicked off, inciting an inflammatory response. The parasympathetics, right, would be looking to increase the aspect of a anti-inflammatory state, and that would be in the aspect of the vagal nerve, which we'll get to. A big part of the parasympathetics, not the entirety of it, but a big part is the vagal nerve, which we'll talk about later on. And so they're in that balance component. When they're balanced, and of course the problem is they're usually not when we're seeing people, and for the vast majority of the population, they're not. The autonomic nervous system is not in balance. So the aspect of our sympathetic response, our stress response, and how it affects insulin. Cortisol is a hormone. Insulin is a hormone. It's also a receptor. It's also a transmitter molecule. It does a whole bunch of things. It binds, insulin binds to glucose and carries it to insulin-dependent cells. Now, there's another thing. We've known this as far back as 1984, that in the stress response, insulin is kind of shut off. It's kind of told, hey, hold back a little bit. Why? Because in the stress response, the body knows it's got to run, it's got to move, it's got to make a decision. It needs to activate its muscles. It needs this vast burst of energy. It needs to be sharp, even on the brain aspect, and all of the from other molecules, aldosterone and other things, even epinephrine as a neurotransmitter, is ramping us up for survivability. So it's telling insulin, hey, calm down. Now, a lot of people, even doctors, get confused. Why? Because they've been taught that insulin is a carrier molecule for glucose, and glucose has to go to the cells in order to be utilized. But what we're finding out is that in this state, in this projected, created state of the body, that glucose can get in without insulin. Because it needs rapid transport. If the muscles need it, it needs to come in. This is critical, and it's critical in this aspect, because what happens now, what happens in our world, what happens in this anti-evolutionary world of ours, people have a stress response, and I'm not going to talk about chronic stress yet, but people have a stress response, and what's required is the exercise component. What's required is the massive utilization of glucose, and it doesn't happen. And this is where we get these vicious cycles start multiple ways, both from too much glucose being dumped into the system, not being utilized, and then having insulin spikes eventually having to occur to carry this glucose to some place. Where does it carry it? Lots of, especially in a chronic stress state, which we'll talk about, to central adipose collection, to central obesity, to central storage, and of course, depending on your hormones and genetics, it'll store it anywhere. But a key here in understanding this is that the imbalance is created in the chronicity of it, and in the system. We have the autonomic nervous system that is always doing this action mode for everything. Even within thought, the aspect of you're giving a mathematical problem, you're given aspects of different types of cognitive thought, the autonomic nervous system is reacting. Your pupils are actually dilating depending upon the math or the complexity of the problem before you. So we're always getting this, whether it is in thought, and of course, the aspect of redundant or perseverating thought in a stress, and that goes to the brain when I'm talking about this, the reason why people will worry, the reason why people will get and not be able to inhibit that thought that's creating the stress. You know, it's coming from the outside, we understand that, it can't be inhibited, it gets in, and it has its effect. So we're gonna see this rocking effect. Now, what happens with the chronicity of the stressor and stressful life as well, whatever the stress is going to be, and stress is coming at us from many angles, many vectors, both from a cognitive, auditory, and we'll talk about this in a second, auditory and visual manner, right? We don't taste stress to an extent. We don't really touch stress. It doesn't come in that way. It mainly comes in through the auditory and the visual processing aspect, and of course then engages with our memory, all right, and the amygdala, the area of emotional state, if you will, and that engages and does, I'm going to get to a second, things which bring up thoughts, and then we have this looping of thought. Now, the chronic state of stress, or the sympathetic state, begins, and we start to see this inability of the weakened parasympathetic able to bring back the sympathetic side. And anyway, it's quite often always being driven. So it like anything else, it starts to get stuck. We'll just say it starts to get stuck. And now we're seeing some of the other negative effects. Now, the negative effects of chronic inflammation. And that's going to come from too much cortisol production and lacking. It comes in spurts. I don't want to get into this part in this discussion, but I'd like to talk about the aspect of the chronic stress. We have this autonomic imbalance that's occurred. We're having the negative effects. It's really important to know that the stress response on an evolutionary basis should only be occurring very rarely. That it would occur when we are survival aspect, when there's fear, a need to fight or flight, one of those things on an extreme measure, and then decision is made, we run away or we fight, and it comes back. Currently today, that's always being stressed, whether it's a scary movie, it's life itself, it's bills, it's relationships, it is the lack of being strong as we get older, lack of exercise, not from the aspect of the glucose, which we're going to get back to. We're going to circle back to that. From the aspect that stress, as muscle mass decreases, gravity has places more and more load or stress on the muscles, which drives the brain even harder, and we have a brain already imbalanced. So stress comes from gravity itself as we weaken through age, and we do not keep our body strong in that aspect. So, so we have this created chronic stress state and this imbalance of the autonomic nervous system. In this one example, it can go the other way as well, but I just want to stick with this for now. I want to put this other thought forward. This is kind of a development I came up with about 10 years ago, and we all understand about carbs and the problem with carbs, and that's paleo and everything else that's out there. But I want to put forward another thought regarding it, and it's this. When we start to develop this vicious cycle, you're in a stress response, and you are what you're doing is inhibiting, making insulin less effective, and you're causing what's called insulin resistance at a membrane cell state as well. That's all part of this of what occurs. Instead of being this flash in the pan on an evolutionary basis, it becomes a chronic state. This is why we're seeing the increase in type 2 diabetes. This is why we're seeing increases in depression, why we're seeing increases in morbidity, and increases in disease states. Many of them, not all of them, of course, but many of the base substrates of disease states. But what's key here is this high level of glucose. The state of glucose that's higher, we're seeing this, starts to become a stress trigger. This is not out there in the literature today. What I want everyone to think about is in the normal state, the brain has a stress response. It does everything I just talked about as far as inflammatory state to make things better. Chronically, it makes things worse. And has a release of glucose available for the muscles to move, the muscles to get you out of the way. That doesn't happen. Glucose isn't utilized. The glucose levels go up, insulin is produced. Here we are. What I believe also happens is a feedback system where the system is off, glucose is already too high, and people eating more carbs. And that the increase of glucose above certain levels in this imbalanced system is a stressor that fires off the stress response in an increasing loop. That the presence of eating that high carb, highly processed food is actually triggering the stress response. And I've seen it throughout my career, and it gets to that level of sensitivity. So I would like us to start to consider that stress from all the modalities and the modes and vectors that it can come in, the stress can be that muffin as well. The stress can be that carbohydrate firing this whole system and creating, making it even worse. And we know that we see the system come down. We know we see changes when people do a ketosis dietary plan, lower the carbohydrate amounts, what have you. But I'm not putting forward, a ketotic diet can be fantastic. But what we can also do to regulate that is to address the autonomic nervous system. We don't even have to touch the food to an extent, is to regulate this, and we won't have the response of the insulin. We can change the insulin sensitivity, the insulin issue, the pro-inflammatory states by addressing the autonomic nervous system as well. Take it from the brain or the neuron, as well as the molecular aspect, in a much more powerful, much more focused approach. So let me just get my notes back up. All right. There's a bunch of little facts here, and I think it's important to bring out. The sympathetic nerves, sympathetic system, is highly connected to lymphoid tissue or the immune system. And the aspect of an inflammatory state, in that first little inflammatory state, when inflammation kicks in, it actually knocks down on the immune response. It's an important thing because we also see the cut down on a pregnant woman on the immune response while she's having a child. We would not want the immune response to start attacking the child, which we can actually see in some cases of pregnancy. But here is where we look at in one level, in one way, and we all know it. It's in the literature. Someone's under stress, their immune system is poor. But one of the rationales is in that high sympathetic tone, it's actually causing inflammatory issues, which are actually going to cause a hypoimmune response or a lowered immune response. And I think just understanding where that lies in the system. Of course, that is connected to all types of things. I want to just bring that out as because it's big. The aspect of hypoimmunity, for opportunistic infections, for increased viruses, bacterial infections, everything, as well as other things related to decreased immune function. And then there's hyperimmunity in the aspect of pollen, of the immune responses along those lines, and then of course autoimmunity, the three types of immunities. And this is regulating and a part of the regulatory mechanism for all of that. Okay. So does somebody have a question? If someone has a question, jump.
I was gonna just ask for, it sounds like what you're saying. So as society, as we are right now, we are in this chronic state of stress all the time. That's really throwing us out of balance. So what you're saying is our inflammatory reaction is on height all of the time. And does that increase our cortisol production just because of that? And yeah, that's why there's so many issues with when you're saying like the glucose levels, and do we crave sugar and carbs because we are in a stress state?
Yeah, this is a great discussion for a stress topic. But you're absolutely right. But if I to answer that, I'll go from the craving. What's really important, and I was talking to Gina today about this, is I'm showing you guys this asymmetry, this imbalance, this set imbalance. It should be here, nice and powerful, doing its job in every aspect, but it gets off in one way or another. Because we could also have more of a parasympathetic dominance. We could also have a system that the sympathetics are low. Now, so the constant on the individual, the constant is the amount of stress and the amount of anti-evolutionary stress and anti-evolutionary behavior. We're sitting all the time. We're not moving. Exercise is, what is exercise? Exercise, I think in the best definition, is a distillation of 15 hours of movement. If we were in evolution, we'd be out hunting, gathering, moving all day long. That drives the brain, it drives the cellular state, it drives all this. And we don't get that now. But exercise has been shown to be good for health because it's a condensation of movement that helps to actuate us at the genetic level. So we are in a stress environment, and we're going to have a stress response. Now, what we see clinically is things like like adrenal fatigue, adrenal insufficiency, even to the aspect of adrenal failure. and practitioners get locked into just looking. They don't realize it. They get into a reductionistic, conventional medicine approach. They just look at the adrenals and they say, well, we'll give adaptogens, we'll do some other stuff for that. And they recognize that an adrenal, when it's up high, it is pumping out cortisol. But then as it fatigues, and really what it is the system is going like this, it starts to hypo produce cortisol. And there we see the inflammatory states rise. It's just not cortisol. There's another corticosteroid in there too. So it's really important to understand what you're looking at. So you could have an individual, yourself, a client, a patient, and everyone's individual. Everyone has their own biochemical, genetic, neurological strengths. And that person could be like this, get a stress response for 2 or 3 or 4 months and crash. Another person could be stressed for decades and have this response. They start up here, they get a response, and then the whole system goes low, but they never come the other way. They're under stress and they're having this sympathetic outflow. And with all of it, and I don't want to get too in detail, then you'll see perturbations of cortisol as opposed to regular productions of it. This is where docs look at these saliva testing and what have you, which you're actually looking at changes in the system. However, you could be looking at someone stress like this, stress, and they shift. Or they could have been this the whole time. They could have had a low sympathetic just genetically. And what you're seeing, you're going to see these people under stress, and their high parasympathetic output is, they're gaining more weight in certain areas of the body. They have diarrhea. They have aspects of great sleepiness. Other components were showing a higher parasympathetic tone. And to this individual, what a practitioner looks at, oh, there's a lot of stress. There's all this stress. So let's do meditation and let's do calming exercises and things like that. That's not what that person needs. You're actually going to make it worse because you're not looking at the system that's actually reacting to the stressor event. So for a majority of people, we do have the sympathetic high tone, parasympathetic low tone, and we can specifically prescribe breath, increasing the vagus nerve, the vagal tone. That's a big portion of the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system is the vagal nerve. It's kind of the tree of life. It comes out of the brainstem and other areas of the brain. It goes down and it senses the organs. It senses the gut and the microbiome and the heart and the lungs. And it also puts out change to those as well. It also sends out signals to make changes and adaptations as well. So it's in a system where the sympathetic drive is high, the system is imbalanced, your vagal tone, your parasympathetic is low, you want to activate that. You want to do the things nutritionally, we'll get into that in a second, nutritionally to help balance it. You want to do the things on a brain drive to help balance it. And that's aspects of breathing, of meditation. It's huge in the literature right now. Everyone can actually start to do this and probably should do a little class in it, is using TENS unit, $40 TENS unit attached. All the research is on the left here, but you can do on the right too. Auricular branches, this is where we see auricular therapy and aspects of acupuncture working because they're stimulating the vagal nerve. And they're increasing the tone on the vagal nerve to bring it back up, forcing or gently asking the sympathetic side to come down back into that balance. So vagal nerve stimulation, very powerful. Breath, all these other things. Also, the aspect on a cognitive level of reframing, perspective changes. I've done this with so many people. Let me give an example. An example of two things. Let's go to the example of the car about to hit you. What happens is visually, you see something coming. It goes into an area of the amygdala, the actual emotional brain, like, oh shit. And that combines with memories and everything else. And before it even gets to the frontal lobe, before anything happens, you're reacting to jump out of the way. You haven't even recognized, the visual centers haven't even recognized it's a car. And you're already moving, depending on your response time. And then it comes up to the frontal lobes. One of the things that's really great to understand about the brain, and also, let me just jump back 1 second. So that was a visual pathway, right? And that caused the stress response. That was good. Auditory pathways, a boss, someone's talking to you, hearing something. It could be a spouse, it could be a partner, it could be anything. And it's coming into the auditory pathway that combines with memory, that brings it to the present. It could bind with, it always is going to bind with emotional response. We don't have thoughts without emotions, or we don't make a decision actually without emotions. So we can't have a thought brought to us without an emotional content. That's definitive, that's researched. And that comes up, the thought is, all of this is going on in the sublayers of the brain, in the unconscious portion, and then it's brought up to your frontal lobes for you to look at. And then that starts this cycle of potential worry or to take an action, and then the system goes down. When we are under chronic stress, when the system, the brain, the autonomic nervous system is out of balance, all this happens to the visual pathway. You look at a bill, you look at something, a to-do list. You look at your child who may be unhappy, or a spouse, you hear things in. So these pathways comes in, it integrates in the sublayers. The sublayers can be weak and out of balance too. That's another discussion. And the responsiveness up isn't so great. And it comes up to the frontal lobes, and now it's presented to the frontal lobes. And how it's presented to the frontal lobes by the sublayers is critical. And then how the frontal lobes frame it. So this is important. How do you diminish the stress response in one way? There's a whole bunch of ways, right? We talked about a whole bunch of ways. TENS units, breathing techniques, moving into meditation, certain types of meditation, specific exercise prescriptions based off of this. Nutrition. Just before I end, we're going to talk about specific nutritional impacts to this system. But from a cognitive aspect, I think one of the most potent ways is a reframing. The aspect is, if I could go in there and reprogram your frontal lobes to not give meaning to anything coming up. No meaning is given, because upon meaning is where we start to have perturbations, feedback to the limbic system, feedback, and we have, these issues. Oh my God, I have no money in my bank account. Of course, it's meaning, blah, blah, blah. I have a bill, whatever. But if I could turn that off, you would have no stress. You would have no cognitive stress arc back. So really important, and it's really amazing when you can take someone's worldview and in a particular way and shift their perspective, reframe that, and embed that. And this is where neurolinguistic programming and other things are very successful, but you can do it in so many ways. And that this is their new perspective. Perception is reality. Shift their perspective, their perception changes, their reality changes, the reality of even the aspect of the stress response. So from the cognitive aspect, we can diminish, even turn off this cognitive aspect of the stress response coming from the top down. And by the way, it always comes from the top down, from the cognitive aspect. So any questions on that? I know there's a kind of big jump right there, but one of the things that I want you to walk away from this point is the understanding that stress from a cognitive aspect is again about a brain integration, bringing it up to the layers of the frontal lobes, and then the frontal lobes, your executive function, making a decision or not, and then this vicious cycle of this looping occurring. And also the other aspect too is this: in a weakened brain state, that how the brain works, it works on levels of inhibition. The top layers of the brain, your frontal lobes, your thinking brain, inhibit the sublayers, and the sublayers inhibit the layers below. And when we are off from inflammation, neuroinflammation, other things that are going on, asymmetries of connections between one side and the other, when the brain is weak, we have what occurs is an inability to inhibit all of this stuff coming up from the sublayers, which induces stress. It should come up with one thought at a time. It just comes up, and the top layer can't say stop. It can't say stop. It can't say inhibit. Just one thing at a time. And we see this intensification of cognition, of cognitive thought, which is adding to the stress on a cognitive level as well. To your point on stress and cravings, yes. What happened? A craving is simply the brain that's being deprived when we're seeing these hypoglycemic, these spikes in the glucose going up, and then rapid insulin, too much insulin being produced, hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin is produced, rapid drops in glucose, hypoglycemic states, physical hypoglycemic states, and then the brain, which is utilizing the massive amount of our calories, needs fuel. And it knows that the cookie, it doesn't call it a cookie, it calls it 35 seconds until I get glucose. And it knows if it eats a cookie, it gets sugar quicker, and that's all it cares about. The brain, neurons of the brain are selfish, and that's all it cares about, and that's what it's gonna get. It knows that the potato is gonna take 25 to 30 minutes. So a craving is a manipulation of the brain for us to create a behavior and an action. And this is where you see your clients going in, opening up the pantry, looking. They don't even know why they're there. They don't, why we're nibbling, why we're snacking, why we cannot stop ourselves from eating an inappropriate food. There's other reasons for that too, from the aspect of food additives, flavorings, inciting the brain. That's a whole different thing. I know most of you guys understand that from the food industry, the chemical manipulation of the brain. But as far as glucose, absolutely, it's come from this less than stable blood glucose level, and the brain demanding blood sugar and food, and it creates what we say is a craving. We are the slave to the master brain. One of the things I do with my clients is I want them in these states of weight loss or fat loss, we want to switch them so that they become the master of food, not a slave to food, not a slave to their brain. And it's very much intertwined in both the autonomic nervous system imbalance, blood sugar aberrations, and state of brain. One of the things, just to finish this off, the autonomic nervous system. There were 4 doctors. I had a collapse of knowledge about 5 months ago, 4.5 months ago at this point. I keep saying it's 4 months, but it's probably anyway. And it's really regarding the whole autonomic nervous system platform. I do a lot of work with the brain. My company is called Functional Brain Training. It uses a hemispherical dynamic model of the brain. It was developed by Dr. Ted Carrick from 1989 and on, seeing the brain as it really operates as two parts, not as one whole. The 4 docs, starting in 1905, Dr. John Beard, who was MD doing pathology, to Weston Price. Many people may have heard of Weston Price, the 20s and 30s. Pottinger, his peer around the same time, and Dr. Donald William Kelly in the late 50s, early 60s to the 80s. All of them independently found that specific food styles, basically a raw food style, 80% raw food, very little, if no protein from animal muscle, animal meat, or organs, and about 20% cooked aspect, is a powerful sympathetic neutralizer. It brings the sympathetic system down. They did it with pure nutrition aspects. John Beard, Dr. Beard, he developed a trophoblastic theory, cell theory. Really what he was looking at was stem cells. And in a nutshell, he recognized, or he did his research, it may have been recognized later by Pottinger, that the autonomic nervous system is regulating down to the level of the stem cell. So in essence, the autonomic nervous system is communicating at a membrane cellular level in the induction of cancer. I'm just going to leave that out there. The autonomic nervous system is regulating to the membrane level, not just sweating, not just gut motility. And then all the way to the other end, where we see these functions, aspects of depression, anxiety, other states of brain, and everything in between. So on the sympathetic side, we see a need for a raw food diet, basically an alkaline state, which a lot of people put forward. You know, the body wants to be alkaline. Well, that's great, but not always. And with understanding the autonomic nervous system, on the parasympathetic side, it requires an acidic state. It requires the cell state is too tight. It is too loose. I'm sorry. It needs to tighten it's called tighten the membranes. I'll just leave it at that. And an acid environment is required to take that the parasympathetic and bring its tone down. And this is where paleo, organ-based meats, that type of plan works very, very well. The people in between, those that are autonomic neutrals, if you will, or balanced, you utilize any type of mechanism that you may see fit for a particular state. But they prove this with thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of patients, each one independently. And that was a big collapse of knowledge for me. That was an incredible understanding that allowed me to really zoom in and to understand. I did a lot of autonomic work, but even more so with understanding this, that these guys were moving the autonomic nervous system with nutritional aspects alone. Another component to this, and I've moved away from supplementation even 10 years ago, not entirely, but immensely stopped utilizing a lot of supplements for a food-first approach. Much more powerful, much more necessary. Doesn't mean I don't use supplementation, I do. That the sympathetic, high sympathetics respond very powerfully to magnesium and potassium. I won't go into the reasons why. And they do very poorly with calcium supplementation. On the other side, the parasympathetics do really well with calcium. Now, there's reasons for a nutritionist to give magnesium and calcium, but if you have this platform of understanding, you might have someone say, well, they have osteopenia, bone loss, and I want to give them calcium or hydroxyapatite or better forms of calcium. But they may be, a lot of people are sympathetics. You're going to give calcium to them and make it worse. And so this broader understanding allows for a much more potent effect, with those people that you're working with. And just as an aside, I have docs, I teach it all the time now, that are giving vitamin D, tons and tons of vitamin D. Vitamin D needs to be given with vitamin A, the right form, in at least a 2-to-1 ratio of A to D. Otherwise, D given by itself is toxic. It's receptor toxic, becomes toxic to the body. Also, it's amazing how many people don't recognize this. For a long time, I didn't recognize it. That D puts calcium into the serum. Vitamin K, in the correct forms, takes it into the bone. So D without K2, especially in its right forms and its right amounts, you're leaving calcium in the plasma, where in inflammatory states, in certain metabolic syndromes and other things, that calcium gets embedded into the intimate lining of arteries, atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries in the heart, the brain, where have you. So that's just an aside. So walking away from this, at what I would love for everyone to just start to think about, just start to grok the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic parasympathetic balance, the aspect of where a person is and what they're presenting with. And I would want us to move both from a nutritional aspect, that we can actually be more specific with our food first, our prescriptions of food to help this counter. With our supplementation, knowing the magnesium, calcium, potassium aspects for this, it's very powerful. But also to take the top-down approach, the aspect of utilizing breath to balance, specific breath recommendations, here, meditation for the high sympathetics, other types of breathing. We're not going into that today, but I just know that we can be more specific. The utilization of TENS, very effective, very powerful. We can all do it, and I can give protocols for that as well. Connected to the left ear, if we stay with the research, vagal nerve drivers, stimulators are big. You're embedding them in bodies. They're doing huge stimulations. And I think there's a problem with a lot of those as well. They can have better response. That we look to change on the thousands of years of meditation, the thousands of years of movement, of yoga, as well as now high intensity training, that we add to the archaic knowledge, or the old knowledge, the ancient wisdom, and we add it to the modern wisdom, that we can give specific prescriptions of movement, of food, of autonomic nervous system stabilization, of thought, and just, I'm going to finish that out, to really look to shift both the brain, the nervous system, and affect all the way down to the membrane level, to affect all the way down to the cellular state, to even affect all these doctors, all 4 of these doctors I mentioned, all they did for the most part, 3 of them, was cancer. Right up to Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez and others who just passed away a few years ago, they were utilizing this information from a nutritional level only to affect cancer, stem cell, cancer generation, and healing. Just one quick thought.
We've finished our hour, so yeah.
I'm done.
We're starting to lose people.
Okay, no, I'm done.
I don't know if any want to open the floor for questions or thoughts, or I don't know if anyone had anything to add.
What is everybody doing out there? How are we looking to affect people?
I have a question.
You're good. You always have a question.
Dr. Don, I have a question for you. And I think I asked you this earlier. How do you recognize the individuals that are more prominent in the area of what you're speaking of, as far as the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic? How do you recognize those people?
Well, in the general, right? And yeah, we did talk about it today. And in the general, you look at, you educate yourself as to sympathetic signs and parasympathetic signs. In the general. So, as an example, a person takes a shower, and they get out of the shower and they continue to sweat. They just sweat now. They dry themselves off and they're continuing sweating. We're seeing a pretty high rev sympathetic system. Individuals with, as an example, postural hypotension, where they're sitting and they stand up, and they're not getting that reactionary aspect from a sympathetic drive. They have a big parasympathetic push. Now, there's other reasons for that. There's reasons for in the inner ear component, but that also inner ear component is part of it's called vestibular nuclei that are actually causing the parasympathetic to jump up, and we're not getting that sympathetic drive. People are getting orthostatic hypotension. Other areas, aspects of sexual dysfunction, although both of them are up, depending on the arousal state, the power of an ejaculation, things along those lines. We can actually, I love to take this into erectile dysfunction and to help those men with it. Women who have orgasm issues, things along those lines. This is extremely powerful to help it with. Other gut motility, gut issues. We're seeing, if you have a gut issue, you're not getting vagal, you have a decreased vagal tone, almost always a decreased vagal tone. Now, you can have these people with, they have irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome is an autonomic nervous system issue with, of course, a microbiome issue. But like I said last time, we must look at the microbiome, all of the bacteria, all of the species, the trillions of species there are like cattle, and the vagal nerve is the rancher, and that rancher takes care of the cattle. The rancher makes sure his fence, the intestinal wall, nobody can get through. He repairs the wall. He does all that. But if the rancher gets sick, the cattle start to go wild. They start to have a problem and a dysfunction. And this is where we put the probiotics in, we put everything else in, and we still don't fix the dysbiosis because you're not addressing the cattle rancher. You put all the stuff in, you put all the wire fencing in, you put all the feed in, but the rancher can't get down to distribute it. So this is where we see gut dysfunction, and you must do autonomic nervous system stabilization and tone changes when you have a gut problem, as well as doing some of the other actions, nutritional actions, of course, things along those lines that we talked about earlier. So you want to educate yourself a little bit about that, so you'll know. And like I said, I'm going to put together, I'm working on it for myself, a form that we can quantify by symptoms and signs. Someone can work on it, fill it out, and you can look at it and you'll get an assessment of tone change. The doctors, any provider out there could also do heart rate variability studies, less than $1,000, maybe $800. It's a little unit, and you can start running heart rate variability studies, which are directly correlating to sympathetic, parasympathetic system balance as well. But I did promise you, Gina, and I am going to deliver it, a autonomic nervous system worksheet.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for all the information.
Oh yeah, listen, there's so much to talk about. Just if the only thing that we can do is just disturb, and disrupt thought. Just get us out of our thinking a little bit and see a wider picture that allows both a closer view to help, but also I like to step back after 30 years, almost 30 years. I did all the testing, I functional lab analysis, all of that, and I still do it. But I really think we're powerful if we start to understand how this works. We can step back and say, hey, let's really utilize meditation. We know the breath, we know it works. There's so many studies from cancer to healing everything. Yeah, right? So, but if we can, but they don't know why. They don't know why, and I really believe, absolutely, categorically, that it's the effect on the autonomic nervous system having the effect on the body itself, from potential for cancer healing to just about everything else. Not everything, but a vast array of most things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, any other questions? Thoughts? You can tell me I'm full of shit too. Absolutely. I wonder, okay, where am I full of shit? And by the way, we know this. No matter what I'm saying, I'm almost going to be wrong anyway. What I mean by that is science is friable. The more we know we don't know. So we use the best knowledge we have to go in and to help a system, a person, a human. But I love the aspect of utilizing these larger effects of meditation, of like you were saying before, Gina, earlier about brushing, skin brushing. But I like to look at it from an evolutionary perspective. I use it a little more specifically to drive the brain, the brushing, but it's all great. It's all stimulatory. When we didn't have clothes for 1 million years and more, when we walked, we didn't have sidewalks, and we actually moved the multivariate directions, that the nature brushed us. nature stimulated us. Even laying on the ground, we had so much stimulation, and we're missing that as a driver as well. So that's why people brush, and they have positive benefits from it. So it's all this stuff is very potent, very powerful, again, to help the human.
Thank you. Any ideas for a topic for next time? We're gonna have to get some dates on the.
Yeah, I have dates. I have dates for you for into July as well. I don't know. I don't know. Anybody have an idea on anything they'd like to hear? I put like 20 possible topics, but that was just possible topics. And it could be anything. It could be aspects of mindful moving, the aspect of brain and mind, which I give lectures on, and utilization of intercommunicative technology, how to use language, both for both intra and interpersonal communication. Very powerful. Love that topic. We talk on the aspects of success theory and practicum. You have someone in front of you, and you could give them the exact thing. It could come from God, and you could hand it to them, and they don't do it, and it doesn't work. The aspect of coaching a client, a patient successfully, allowing them to be successful, that is a wonderful, enormous topic.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and again, also we haven't done it, the microbiome, looking at the gut, which now we have this talk, and now we can go into a deeper exploration of gut modulation, working the how to heal the microbiome.
Yeah,
You know?
I'm interested in like the microbiome as it relates to mental health. That's an interesting reading for me. Yeah.
Well, we could do one on that, and my phrase I coined: sad state, stress, anxiety, depression. Mm-hmm. So we could look at stress, anxiety, depression as linked to the microbiome. So we look at the enteric nervous system, what's going on there, and then the gut-brain connection. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, whatever anyone wants to talk about, and even if no one's here, I'll still talk about it. And we'll in the future. Yeah, what I really want to everyone is I love it. Gina is fantastic. Gina is hungry for knowledge, and just if you're not hungry for knowledge, doesn't mean you're not fantastic. I'm looking for knowledge too. I'm looking for feedback. I'm looking for people to say, I did this and this, and it's working. Or here's some research that I saw, and I've been doing this. I'm like, oh wow, one of my gifts is absolutely synergism, is synergizing seemingly even disparate information or knowledge or data, but also, of course, the obvious data and putting it together. So I love making sense of things, and at least a sensible model that we all can work from if we choose. And so it's I'm looking for feedback as well. Yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we will come up with a topic and the dates and let everyone know what those are, so we can coordinate it with my calendar as well and get that out there.
Yeah, and I'm actually expanding. I'm talking to so many people, Camille, that I'm going to start bringing other people because for my distributorship with ADK2 and some of the other. So people are I'm going to combine this with some of my other educational processes for my seemingly exploding sales force. It's just fantastic on every level. I think it's just a great forum for us.
Good. All right, wait, I should stop the recording.
Yeah.
All
yeah.
Right.